The bank teller kept her smile glued on while she slid my debit card back and turned her screen so I could see it. And right there in the transaction list was a wire I never approved that had my name on it and my brother's phone number in the notes. And behind me, my dad's voice went sharp enough to cut, asking why I was pretending to be surprised when I was the one who handled the accounts. I felt heat climb my neck because I could already see where the story was going to land, not on the person who actually did it, but on me, the guy standing at the counter in work boots smelling like diesel from our delivery van. The teller asked if I wanted to dispute it. My dad said, "Don't make a scene," and my mom started crying like the money had already turned into a funeral. My brother Mason texted me from somewhere that sounded loud and bright, saying, "Chill, I'll fix it." And that was the moment I realized he wasn't just gambling again. He was gambling with our business under my login. We ran a family hardware and supply shop in Southern Ohio, the kind of place contractors hit at 6 in the morning for box blades and concrete mix, and the kind of place retirees wandered into at noon just to talk about weather and buy one bolt they didn't need. And it was never a glamorous operation, but it was steady, and steady is what kept my parents calm. I was the one who came back after the Marines and actually liked the rhythm of it. Orders, deliveries, payroll on Fridays, inventory counts that felt like working a puzzle, while my brother was the guy with charm and a grin who could sell a grill to someone who came in for a light bulb. That was our balance. I handled the guts, Mason handled the noise, and my parents acted like the whole thing ran on family love, even though it really ran on margins and timing and me double-checking everything, because my dad hated computers and my mom hated conflict. The night before that bank visit, Mason had asked me to reset the account password because he forgot it again, and I had rolled my eyes and did it. And he slapped my shoulder and said, "You're the man." And I felt stupid later because it was the same tone he used when he wanted me to cover for him. At the bank, my dad marched us out to the parking lot like he was carrying us through a storm, and he got in my face by the hood of his truck, jaw working, eyes bright with that rage he saved for family because strangers didn't deserve it. He said, "You are the one with access. You are the one who signs. You are the one who told me Mason was doing better." And I tried to explain that access doesn't mean guilt, that I didn't send a wire, that the note literally had Mason's number on it. And my mom grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug in and begged me to stop because people were looking. Mason didn't show up. Of course he didn't. And my dad kept saying we can't call the police on our own son, like the only options were silence or prison. And I said I'm not trying to ruin him. I'm trying to keep us from losing everything. And my dad said, "If we lose everything, it will be because you turned this into a war." I watched him climb into the driver's seat, watched my mom fold into the passenger seat like she'd been drained, and I stood there alone between trucks and minivans with my phone buzzing in my palm and a tightness in my chest that wasn't fear yet, but was turning into something close. Back at the store, I pulled the transaction records and the audit log, and it took me 10 minutes to see what mattered. The login was mine, but the device wasn't. A late-night access from an IP address that traced back to a sports bar near the casino across the state line. And for a second I felt relief because it was clean proof. Then I realized proof doesn't matter inside a family that already picked its version of the truth, because my parents didn't want a culprit. They wanted the mess to disappear without anyone having to admit they raised the guy who keeps lighting matches. I drove to the bar anyway, not to start a fight, just to see him in the light. And when I walked in, the place smelled like fried food and stale beer, and the TVs were all screaming about some game I didn't care about. And Mason was at a high-top table with two guys I didn't recognize, laughing too loud, hands moving too fast, and when he saw me he didn't flinch, he smiled like I'd come to congratulate him. He said, "Hey, big brother, you look intense," and I said, "We need to talk now." And one of the guys with him leaned back and looked me up and down like I was a product he might buy if it was discounted. Mason walked out with me, still smiling, and he kept acting like he was doing me a favor by giving me his time, like I was a coworker, not the brother who covered his shifts when he disappeared and told our parents he had the flu. I showed him the audit log on my phone, and I watched his eyes flick down and then back up, and that tiny pause was the closest thing to honesty I'd seen from him in months. He said, "It's not what you think," and I said, "I don't care what I think. I care what is true." And he said he needed a bridge, just a bridge, because he had a system and he was about to win it back. And when I heard the word system, I felt my stomach drop, because every gambler uses that word the way drunks use the word tomorrow. I told him he stole from the business, from our parents, and he shrugged and said it's family money, Like that made it softer. And then he said the part that made my ears ring. He said I used your login because Dad would freak out if it was mine. I wanted to grab him by the shirt and shake him until his teeth clicked, but I didn't, because the last thing I needed was a brawl in a parking lot with strangers watching, and because some piece of me still wanted him to snap out of it without me becoming his enemy. I told him we were going back to the store, we were telling Mom and Dad, and he laughed like I'd suggested a comedy show. He said if you do that, they will never forgive you. And I said they should be furious at you. And he said they already are, but not the way you think. And then he leaned in close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. And he said they've been talking about selling. They're scared. And you being the responsible one makes it easy for them to blame you, because you're the one who can take it. I stared at him and felt a strange coldness spread through my hands. Because he wasn't pleading, he was offering strategy, like we were on the same team against our parents. And I realized he'd been playing all sides for a while. When I got back to the store, my dad was in the office with the door closed. And through the glass I saw him on the phone, posture rigid, and I saw my mom at the counter trying to ring up a customer while her hands shook so badly she dropped the receipt paper. I stepped behind the counter and asked her where Dad had called, and she whispered that he called the bank manager, and then she whispered that he called our lawyer, and then she whispered the thing that made my throat go dry. She said he asked if we could put your name on the line for the debt, since you're the one with the good credit. I stared at her and waited for her to say she was kidding, but she didn't. She just looked down and pressed her fingers against the edge of the counter like it might keep her from falling. I walked to the office door, heard my dad say my son will handle it, and I pushed the door open and watched him turn with that same look he used at the bank. Already set, already decided. And he said, close the door. We need to talk about how you're going to fix this. He laid out a plan like it was reasonable. Refinance the shop's small warehouse loan under my name. Extend our credit line. Keep the doors open long enough for Mason to straighten out. And he said it with that tone where the idea becomes an order. I asked him if Mason had admitted anything. And he said Mason swears he's working on it. And I said you didn't answer me. And my dad's face tightened. And he said it doesn't matter, because the bank doesn't care who clicked what. The bank cares who pays. I told him I had proof it was Mason. And he snapped that I was obsessed with proving people wrong instead of keeping the family together. And then he said the line I still hear in my head at weird times. He said you were always the one who wanted to be in charge. So congratulations. Now you're in charge of cleaning up the mess. I asked him why Mason wasn't in this office having this conversation, and my dad said because Mason is fragile right now, and you are not. And that's when I realized my parents had built their whole parenting style around Mason's fragility and my durability. And now they were using it like a weapon. I refused to sign anything that day, and my dad didn't yell. He went quieter, which was worse, because quiet meant he was done seeing me as his son for the moment and was seeing me as a problem. I left the office, helped my mom finish the day, locked up at closing, and drove home with my phone buzzing from Mason again and again, messages that bounced between sorry and angry, as if he couldn't decide whether to hug me or blame me. I got to my apartment and sat in my truck in the dark for 10 minutes before I went inside because I didn't want my girlfriend to see my face yet. And when I finally stepped out, my phone lit up with a new notification from our bank, an alert that a second wire had been initiated and was pending approval, and the login shown on the alert was mine again. I drove back to the store with my heart hammering and my hands locked on the steering wheel, and I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation that didn't end with us losing everything. But when I pulled into the lot, I saw the office lights on, and the front door cracked open, and I knew someone was inside even though we were closed. And as I walked up, I heard the printer spitting paper in quick bursts like a nervous laugh. I pushed the door open and saw my dad at the desk with forms spread out, and my mom standing behind him crying into her hands. And on the desk was a signature line with my name typed under it. And my dad looked up like he'd been caught and said we didn't have time to wait for you. I stepped closer and saw the pen in his hand, and I saw my signature already half formed on the page in a shaky imitation, and I felt my whole body go still because whatever happened next was going to burn a bridge I couldn't rebuild. My dad said I did what I had to do, and I said you forged my signature, and he said don't use that word, and I said what word do you want, and he slammed the pen down and said do you want your brother dead in a ditch because you wanted to be right. My mom made a sound like she was choking and said please. Please, and I stood there staring at the paper until the letters blurred, because I was looking at my life getting drafted into a debt I didn't create. and the worst part was knowing they were going to call it love. I reached for the document, and my dad reached too, and his hand covered mine. And he said, if you tear that up, you are tearing up this family. And behind him on the office monitor, I saw the pending wire details, a destination account with a name I didn't recognize, and an amount big enough to empty us. I let go of the paper and stepped back, and I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the signature attempt, of the pending wire, of everything, and my dad's eyes narrowed like he finally understood I wasn't going to be the quiet fix anymore. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Making sure I'm not the one who gets buried," and my mom whispered my name like it hurt her to say it. My dad took the forms and shoved them into a folder and said, "Get out." And I didn't move, because my anger finally had somewhere to stand, and I said, "If you send that wire, I'm calling the bank right now and freezing everything." My dad stepped around the desk fast, too fast for his age, and he grabbed my wrist hard enough that my phone nearly slipped. And he said, "If you do that, you will be the one who destroys us, not Mason." I yanked my wrist free and walked out and dialed the bank from the parking lot with my breath coming in short bursts that didn't match the words I forced out. And when the fraud department answered, I gave them my information and told them to put a hold on all outgoing transfers until I came in with ID. The woman on the line asked if I was safe, and I almost laughed at how normal that question sounded compared to what was happening. And I said I'm fine, but then I looked back through the store window and saw my dad holding the folder and my mom clutching his arm, and it hit me that the people who raised me had just tried to drag me under with them. As I drove away, Mason called, and I answered. And he didn't start with sorry. He started with a threat dressed as a joke, telling me if I blew this up, I'd better be ready for mom and dad to hate me for the rest of my life. The next morning, the bank confirmed the hold, but the hold didn't undo what had already happened. And what had already happened was our accounts showing stress in all the places customers never see until it's too late. Vendors started calling about late payments. The credit card processor flagged us, and a contractor I'd known since I was a teenager pulled me aside at the counter and said, "Your dad looks like a man who hasn't slept in a week. Is everything okay?" And I lied because I still didn't want to be the guy who aired it out. That lasted until lunchtime, when a sheriff's deputy walked in and asked for me by name, polite but direct, and my stomach dropped because that meant someone had already filed something. My dad came out of the back office and greeted the deputy like he was a friend, which felt wrong. And the deputy asked if we could talk privately, and my dad said sure. And then he turned to me with that same quiet voice and said, "Come on, you need to hear this." In the office, the deputy said the bank had reported a suspicious attempted transfer and asked a few standard questions: who had access, who approved wires, who handled passwords, and my dad answered every one like he was reading a script where my name was the main character. He said, "My son does all the online stuff. I don't even know how to log in." And the deputy looked at me like he was trying to figure out whether I was scared or guilty, and I could feel sweat forming under my shirt. I told the deputy the truth in a way that wouldn't sound like I was just throwing my brother under the truck. I said Mason had access. Mason asked me to reset passwords. Mason's number was in the wire note, and I had evidence of logins from a device that wasn't mine. My dad cut in and said Mason would never do that, and the deputy held up a hand and said he wasn't here to arrest anyone today. He was here to gather information, but he also said the bank could pursue it as fraud, and then he asked for the audit logs. My dad's jaw clenched because he didn't like paperwork unless it benefited him, and he said, "We'll provide whatever you need," and then he added, almost casually, "My son tends to overreact," like he was planting that seed in a law enforcement officer's mind. After the deputy left, my dad rounded on me and said, "You just put your brother in a cage," and I said I just kept myself out of one. And my mom walked in with a stack of invoices and said the distributor won't release our next shipment, and her voice cracked in the middle like a snapped wire. My dad stared at the invoices and then at me and said we were going to lose the business because you couldn't stay loyal. And I said loyalty isn't letting Mason empty the store into a casino, and my dad's face went hard, and he said, "You're not listening. You're not hearing me." And then he said the thing that changed how I saw the ground under my feet. He said Mason didn't do this alone. My mom flinched like she knew what was coming, and my dad said, "I know about your little savings account, the one you never told us about, the one you built while you lived cheap after the Marines." And he said it like a sin, not a smart move. And he said if you had just given us that money, none of this would be happening. I stared at him because it wasn't true. It was never going to be true. There is never enough money to fill a hole dug by someone who enjoys digging. My dad said you hid that from us, so don't pretend you're the honest one. And my mom started crying harder and said, why can't you boys just stop? And I felt something in me shift, because I realized they weren't confused about what Mason did. They were angry that Mason's habits were finally costing them comfort, and I was the easiest place to put that anger because I wouldn't collapse the way Mason did. I walked out of the office and into the warehouse where the air was cooler, and I leaned against a shelf of boxed lawnmower parts and tried to slow my breathing, and my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said stop talking or we start collecting, and it included our store address like a signature. I showed the message to my girlfriend Erin that night, and she didn't try to make it small. She read it twice and then asked me who Mason owed. I told her I didn't know, which was the truth, and she said you need to know, because if someone is using that kind of language, they're not a friendly creditor, and I hated that she was right. The next day, I went back to the bar near the casino and asked the bartender if he knew Mason, and the bartender gave me a look that said I wasn't the first brother to ask. Then he said Mason wasn't here anymore. Mason found a better place, and he nodded toward the back like a door I couldn't see. I pushed my luck and asked who Mason played with, and the bartender said you don't want to know, and then he slid me a receipt paper with a name scribbled on it, Travis Cole, and an address on the Kentucky side of the river. I tucked it into my pocket, thanked him, and walked out feeling like I was stepping onto a track with a train already coming. The address was a small office park with tinted windows and no sign on the door, and I sat in my truck across the lot watching people come and go like it was a dentist's office, except nobody looked like they were getting their teeth cleaned. A guy in a polo opened the door and looked straight at my truck, and I felt my shoulders tense, and then my phone rang, and it was my mom. And she said Mason came home, and I could hear my dad shouting in the background, and she said please come to the house now, and her voice was so raw I didn't argue. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, Mason's car was there, and his hands were shaking when he opened the door, and he looked worse than I expected, eyes sunken, skin dull, like his body had been burning fuel it didn't have. My dad grabbed my arm the second I stepped inside and said we're going to handle this like a family, and Mason stood behind him and said yeah, like a family, and I realized they had already rehearsed what they wanted from me before I even arrived. My dad said I was going to sign the refinancing papers, and my mom nodded like it was the only air left in the room. And Mason said once the pressure is off, he can focus and work and pay it back. And I asked him who Travis Cole was, and Mason's eyes flicked away for half a second, and my dad said none of that matters right now. I said it matters to me, and Mason said you're acting like a cop, and my dad said you always did love rules, didn't you? And then my mom said the quiet part out loud. She said if you don't sign, they're going to take the store. And then she looked at Mason and added, and they're going to take your brother. Mason stepped forward and grabbed my shoulder, and his grip was too tight, and he said just do it. And I felt my heart slam because his voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was command, like he'd learned a new way to survive, and it involved using me. I told them no, and the room went silent except for my mom's breathing, and my dad's face went red in a way that made me think he might actually hit me, which he never did when I was a kid because he didn't need to. Words were enough. He said you would rather watch your brother get hurt than share the burden, and I said the burden is not mine, and he said you're not leaving this house until we fix this, and Mason closed the front door behind me with a click that felt like a lock. Erin was outside in her car because I told her to stay back, and for a second I wished she had ignored me and come inside, because I suddenly understood I wasn't in a family meeting. I was in an ambush, and I watched Mason step toward the hallway like he was going to get something, and my mom wiped her face and said please, and my dad said sign it. And then my phone buzzed again in my pocket with another message from that unknown number, this one saying we are on our way. My hands were shaking when I pulled my phone out, and my dad saw the screen, and his eyes narrowed, and Mason's face went pale like he knew exactly what it meant, and I realized the next few minutes were going to decide whether we lost the business, whether someone got arrested, and whether my family ever spoke to me again. I didn't sign, but I also didn't keep standing there like a target, and I said everyone sit down, right now, because if someone is coming, we need to be smart, and my dad laughed like I was playing hero, but my mom sat down because fear makes people obey the first voice that sounds certain. Mason hovered near the hallway, and I told him to put his phone on the table, and he refused, and I stepped closer and said put it down, and he finally did with a little toss like he was humoring me. I picked it up and scrolled fast, and my stomach clenched because the message thread was there: Travis, cash amounts, dates, and a photo Mason had sent of our store safe with the door open. I felt a heat behind my eyes, not tears, something closer to rage, and Mason said don't, and my dad said give him his phone, and I looked at my mom and said you want to know what's happening? This is what's happening, and she covered her mouth like she might throw up. There was a knock at the door, heavy and impatient, and my dad started toward it because of course he did, like he could negotiate with sheer stubbornness. I got between him and the door and said no, and he shoved my shoulder, and I shoved back, and he stared at me like I'd crossed some line that existed only for him. The knock came again, and a voice called out, "Mason," and my mom made a small sound like a wounded animal. Mason's eyes went wet, and he said I can talk to them, and I said no you can't, because you already did and you made it our problem, and I grabbed my keys off the table and told my mom to grab her purse, and she froze, and I said, "Mom, now," and she moved like her body had finally decided. My dad snapped that we weren't running, and I said we're not running. We're leaving your pride behind for 5 minutes so nobody gets stupid, and then I called 911 and told the dispatcher there were people at my parents' house threatening us over a debt, and I said it calmly even though my chest felt like it was full of rocks. The dispatcher asked for the address, and as I gave it, the front door handle started to rattle, and Mason stood there staring at it like the door was a mirror and he didn't want to see his own face. My dad kept saying hang up, and I ignored him, and then the dispatcher said officers were on the way, and she told me to stay on the line and stay inside if I could, and I said we're trying, and I heard a sound outside like someone hitting the door with the side of a fist. My dad finally looked afraid, not for Mason, not for me, for the house, for the idea that the outside world was touching his private mess. I told everyone to get into the back room and stay away from windows, and my dad protested until another slam hit the door, and then he moved. We waited in the back like kids hiding from a storm, and the worst part was the silence between impacts, the way my mom's breathing filled the room and Mason's fingers tapped like he was counting down. When sirens finally cut through the air, the banging stopped, and the dispatcher told me officers had arrived. I stepped into the front room and saw a red and blue light smear across the walls, and I cracked the door just enough to see a deputy talking to 2 men in polos, one of them gesturing toward our house with the calm confidence of someone used to not being told no. The deputy looked over and saw me, and he nodded like he remembered me from the store, and he told the men to step back. The men argued, but they stepped back, and one of them looked at me and smiled like we were doing business, and that smile made my skin crawl. After the deputies took statements and the men left, my dad turned his anger back on me like a reflex, and he said, "You called the cops. You humiliated us. You put Mason on a list," and my mom said stop, but she didn't sound convinced. She sounded exhausted. Mason sat on the couch with his head in his hands, and he whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far," and my dad said you shouldn't have provoked them, and I snapped that I didn't provoke anyone. Mason did, and my dad's eyes went cold, and he said you always talk like you're clean, but you're the one who just brought police to our door. I stared at him and realized he was never going to blame Mason in front of me, because if he did that, he'd have to admit he failed at protecting his favorite, and admitting that would break his identity. My mom looked at me and said, "What are we supposed to do now?" And I said, "We tell the truth. We protect the store. We protect ourselves." And Mason lifted his head and said, "If you tell the truth, I'm done." The next day, my dad didn't show up to work. He left me and my mom to open the shop, and customers kept coming like nothing happened, because the world doesn't pause for your family crisis. Vendors kept calling, and the bank wanted a meeting. And then our lawyer called and asked me to come in alone. I sat across from him in a cramped office that smelled like printer ink, and he told me my dad had been there already, and my dad had tried to assign certain liabilities to me as the operational manager. I asked him if that was even possible, and the lawyer did that careful face lawyers do when they're about to say something you won't like. Then he said your dad is claiming you authorized the transfers to cover inventory purchases and that Mason is being framed. My ears rang, and I asked him why he would do that. And the lawyer said because your father is scared of losing the business and he thinks the quickest way to stop the bleeding is to keep the bank calm and keep Mason out of it. I asked what that meant for me, and he said it means you need your own counsel immediately, because if the bank or the state thinks you were knowingly involved, they can come after you personally. I left that office shaking so hard I had to sit in my truck and press my hands against the steering wheel until they steadied. And I called Erin and told her we needed to lock down my accounts and move anything valuable out of my apartment because I didn't know who was about to make me the fall guy. Erin didn't ask if I was exaggerating. She asked what I needed, and I told her I needed someone who wasn't my family, someone who wasn't invested in the fantasy that this could be fixed with silence. She said her aunt worked in compliance at a regional bank and could point me to the right people. And an hour later, I was sitting in a coffee shop with a woman named Denise who had kind eyes and a direct voice. Denise listened, asked for dates, asked for screenshots, asked about access controls, and when I showed her the attempted forged signature photo, her face changed in a way that made me feel both vindicated and sick. She said you need to protect yourself, and you need to do it now, because families do stupid things when money and shame collide, and she offered to walk me through how to present evidence to the bank without making it look like revenge. That meeting gave me a plan, and it also gave me a new fear, because once I moved, there was no going back to pretending this was just a phase. I went to the bank with Denise's checklist and asked to speak to their fraud investigator, and I handed over logs, device data, screenshots of Mason's messages, and proof the signature wasn't mine. The investigator listened and took notes and said he couldn't give me outcomes yet, but he did say the forged signature attempt was serious and could trigger its own investigation. I walked out feeling like I'd just lit a fuse, and when I got to the parking lot, my mom called and said your father knows what you did, and her voice was tight, and she said he says you're trying to destroy Mason to punish him, and I asked her what she believed, and she didn't answer directly. She just said come to dinner. Please, we need to talk. Like dinner could fix what evidence couldn't. At my parents' house, my dad sat at the table with a folder of papers like he was about to run a meeting, and Mason was there too, cleaned up, calm, eyes too bright, like he'd rehearsed calm in front of a mirror. My mom placed plates down with hands that still trembled, and my dad said we need to settle this. And Mason said I'm ready to be honest, and I almost believed him until he looked at me and said I did it because you froze me out. I stared at him because it was such a clean twist, such a simple flip, and my dad leaned back like he'd been waiting for it. Mason said you always acted like I was a screw-up and like you were the hero, and when Dad asked me for help, you treated it like a courtroom, and I needed money fast, and you left me alone with it, so I made a choice. My dad nodded like that was logic, and my mom cried again, and I felt my fists tighten under the table because Mason wasn't confessing, he was accusing. Then Mason pulled out his phone and slid it across the table to my dad. And he said I've got proof Liam wanted to push me out, and my dad picked it up and started scrolling, and I realized Mason had been building a case, not to save us, but to save himself by burying me. My dad's face changed from anger to something colder, something decided, and he looked up and said we're going to do this the right way, and by right way he meant the way that keeps Mason's name clean. He said you will sign the refinancing, and you will sign a statement that you handled the wires, because you can take the hit and Mason can't. And then he leaned forward and said if you don't, we will tell everyone in town you stole from us, and you tried to blame your brother to cover it. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, and I looked at my mom, waiting for her to say no, waiting for her to stand up and slap the table and tell them both they'd lost their minds. But she just stared at her plate like it was safer than looking at me. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor, and my dad flinched like he expected violence. But I didn't touch him. I just said I'm done being your shield. Mason smirked, and he said you're being dramatic, and my dad said sit down and act like a man, and I said I am acting like a man. I'm walking away before you ruin me for him. I walked out, and my mom didn't follow, and in my truck I started shaking again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of realizing the people I'd been loyal to my whole life were ready to sacrifice me without even making it look painful. My phone buzzed as I drove, and it was a voicemail from the bank investigator asking me to call back immediately, and when I pulled over and listened, he said there had been another attempt to move funds, and this time the instruction included my personal account information, like someone was trying to make it look like the money went to me. I called back with my voice tight and told him I was not authorizing anything, and he said he believed me, but belief wasn't the point anymore, because now someone was actively setting me up. I called Denise, and she told me to file a police report for identity misuse and forgery and to get an attorney, and she said it like there was no other lane left. I drove to the sheriff's office and sat under fluorescent lights with a deputy who typed while I talked. and I handed over screenshots and the forged signature photo and the new transfer attempt. The deputy asked who might benefit from making it look like I stole, and I stared at the wall because the answer was my own family, and saying it out loud felt like swallowing glass. When I left, Erin was waiting in the parking lot, and she hugged me hard enough that my ribs hurt, and she said, "You don't have to go back," and I nodded, and then my phone rang, and it was my mom. And she said, "Your dad is going to the store tomorrow to tell everyone you embezzled," and she said it in a flat voice like she was reporting the weather, and I said, "Are you going to stop him?" And she whispered, "I don't know how." The next morning, I went to the store before opening and stood in the empty aisles listening to the hum of the refrigeration unit in the back, and I thought about how many times I'd walked those aisles as a kid, how safe it used to feel, and now it felt like a stage where I was about to be executed in public. Erin sat in her car outside, ready to call for help if something got ugly, and my attorney, a guy named Mark Halpern who spoke like he'd seen every version of this mess, met me at the front door. Mark told me to stay calm, to let the facts do the talking, and then my dad pulled into the lot with Mason behind him, and they walked in like they owned the air. My dad didn't even look at me at first. He walked to the counter and started greeting early customers with that friendly voice he used when he wanted to look like the good guy. And then he said loud enough for everyone to hear that there had been financial misconduct and he needed to address it. I felt my stomach twist, but Mark stepped forward and said, "We will address it," and my dad's eyes snapped to him like he hated that I brought an outsider. My dad said, "Who are you?" And Mark said, "I represent Liam." And my dad scoffed and said, "Of course you do, because Liam thinks everything is a lawsuit." Mason leaned on a shelf and watched like he was enjoying a show, and my dad turned to the customers and said there have been unauthorized transfers, and the person responsible is no longer part of the business. I opened my mouth, but Mark raised a hand slightly, just enough to remind me not to explode. And then Mark said the bank has evidence of compromised credentials and attempted forgery, and we have reported it. And he said it calmly, like reading a menu. One of our regulars, a contractor named Pete, looked between us and said, "Liam's the one who always paid my invoices on time." "What are you talking about?" And my dad's face tightened because this was slipping from his script. Mason stepped in then, and he said, "Liam's always been jealous of me. He wants to run the place alone." And I felt something hot flare in my chest because it was such a lazy lie, and yet I knew people would believe it because it fit the story my parents had told about us for years. Responsible Liam, dramatic Liam, cold Liam, and charming Mason who just needs grace. I stepped forward and said, "I'm not jealous. I'm furious." And my dad snapped, "See, there it is." And Mark said, "We have documentation showing the transfers were initiated from a device linked to Mason and a destination account linked to a private lender." And Mason's smile flickered for half a second, just a crack, and that crack was the best thing I'd seen in weeks. My dad's face went pale, and he said, "That's not true." And Mark said, "It is true." And then the front door opened, and two men in suits walked in and asked for Daniel Pierce, my dad. And the taller one said he was with the bank's investigations unit. The air in the store changed like someone shut off oxygen, and customers stopped moving, and my mom wasn't there. And I felt a sudden sick relief because it meant my dad couldn't control the room anymore. The investigator said there were allegations of forgery and misrepresentation, and he needed to secure certain records immediately, and my dad tried to laugh it off, tried to talk his way around it, but the investigator didn't smile back. Mason started backing toward the aisle like he wanted distance, and the investigator looked at him and said, "Mr. Pierce, we need to speak with you as well." And Mason's face went tight and angry, and he looked at me like this was my fault. My dad turned to me with a look that wasn't just anger now. It was betrayal mixed with panic, and he said, "You did this." And I said, "No, you did this. You just expected me to be the one who paid for it." The investigator asked for access to the office computer, and my dad hesitated, and that hesitation was everything, because it showed he'd been hiding things. Mark told me to stay back while he spoke, and I watched from the aisle while my father's shoulders sagged and Mason's jaw clenched. A woman who worked for us, Carla, whispered to me that she was sorry, and I nodded, and I realized I'd been holding my breath waiting for someone to see me as human again. The investigators said the bank would be freezing the business accounts pending review, and my dad's face crumpled like someone punched him, and he said, "You can't do that. You'll kill us." And the investigator said these actions are intended to prevent further loss. Mason suddenly snapped that Liam did it. Liam's trying to steal the business, and the investigator looked at him like he was a kid yelling at a referee, then asked him for his phone. Mason refused, and the investigator said, "If you refuse, that will be noted," and my dad stepped between them and said, "We can cooperate." "We're cooperating," and he looked at Mason with a sharp warning that finally sounded like a parent, not an accomplice. Mason's hands shook as he pulled his phone out, and I watched him unlock it with a swipe that looked like defeat. The investigator took it and said, "Thank you," and Mason's eyes locked on mine with a hate I'd never seen from him as a kid, and it wasn't just hate. It was fear, because for once he couldn't charm his way out. My dad grabbed my arm and hissed that I was dead to him, and I pulled away and said, "Don't touch me," and the whole store went quiet, and I realized everyone was watching a family fall apart in real time. By afternoon, the store was effectively shut down, not by an eviction or a padlock, but by frozen accounts and stunned staff, and my dad sat in the office with his head in his hands while the investigator copied files. My mom finally showed up, eyes swollen, and she walked straight to Mason and cupped his face like he was still 8. And she said, "What did you do?" And he whispered, "I tried to fix it." And she started sobbing in a way that sounded like she'd been holding it in for years. My dad looked up at me and said, "If you loved this family, you would have handled it quietly." And I said, "Quietly is how it grew." Aaron stood behind me, not speaking, just present, and that presence felt like a rope around my waist, keeping me from being dragged back into the old role.